Now can I say it gives me great pleasure and pride to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Professor Tom Calma. Professor Calma is an Aboriginal elder from the Kungarakan tribal group and a member of the IIMHL tribal group in the Northern Territory, and has been involved in Indigenous affairs at a local, community, state, national and indeed international level for more than 40 years. Tom is the co-chair of Reconciliation Australia and a former Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission. He was the founding chair of the Close the Gap campaign for Indigenous health equity. He is also currently co-chair of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Advisory Group, the National Coordinator for the Closing the Gap Tackling Indigenous Smoking Measures, and Chancellor of the University of Canberra. We are really honoured to have you here to speak to us this morning, Tom. Welcome.
Wow, great to look out and see everybody here today. So firstly, can I thank Chicka Madden for his warm welcome to country, and I also acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and their elders past and present. And I'd also like to recognise their youth, as I do with all youth, who are going to be our future leaders, the custodians of our stories, our cultures, our histories and our languages. And I've got a dirty glass, so can't you see it? Yeah, hopefully that works, yeah. Thank you, Eddie Bartnick, for your words of wisdom and information that you've set the scene on what I wanted to talk about today, and also Commissioner John Finelli for your kind introduction. I'd also like to thank the Commissioner and his team for the tremendous feat of organising this international event and asking me to be your speaker today. And I'd also like to recognise a guy called Chris Holland for his enduring support to Indigenous health. He's one of those behind-the-scenes people who for us, he's not Indigenous, has provided a lot of support in and around Indigenous health and mental health and suicide prevention. Now, while I do not want to repeat what the Commissioner's naming of the many noteworthy people here today, and Natasha also, I'd also like to acknowledge you. And can I also make special mention of the Indigenous mental health, addiction and disability leaders, experts, consumers and those who've had lived experience here today, including those from New Zealand, Canada and the US and all the other countries who have travelled here so far to be with us. I welcome all of you to this combined meeting of the International Initiative for Mental Health Leadership and International Leadership for Disability Leadership, International Initiative for Disability Leadership 2017. In the past decade, the world has received wake-up calls about mental health and disability crises in its midst. Worldwide, depression is estimated by the World Health Organization to affect more than 300 million people. About 800,000 die due to suicide every year, and it's the second leading cause of death in 15 to 29-year-olds across the globe. In 2011, the WHO reported 1 billion persons living with disability, and about 15%, that represents about 15% of the world's population, with 110 to 190 million people having very significant difficulties in functioning. Four like these are important because they put global mental health and disability movements at the forefront to be able to address the global challenges. And such global responses are appropriate given the common impacts of mental health problems and disabilities that our populations experience. Tragically today, those living with mental health problems or disabilities are increasingly becoming members of an underclass. This challenges our society's fundamental values of democratic participation, fairness, social justice and equality of opportunity. So how can our communities truly thrive with such growing social exclusion along health, mental health and disability defined lines? How many amazing and enriching contributions from people with mental health problems and disabilities will be missed in such circumstances? Conversely, our societies, communities and families' capacity to thrive is challenged when untreated mental health problems manifest as antisocial behaviour, particularly in the young. Our families' capacity to thrive is undermined by overwhelming care responsibilities in the absence of adequate support services. And we must not forget that our societies and communities thrive when the families and individuals within them thrive, and fail to thrive when families and individuals fail to thrive. Please do not imagine that because Australia is one of the wealthiest nations in the world, somehow it stands apart from the global situation. No, this country is but a microcosm of the world when it comes to the scale of the disability and mental health challenges. About 18.5% of the population have a disability, and 6% have severe or profound disabilities. Over 45% of all Australians are expected to experience a common mental health-related condition such as depression, anxiety, or a substance use disorder in their lifetime. And around 600,000 of us are estimated to have severe mental illness, and about 2.7 million are in carer roles of various kinds, and that represents around 12% of our population. And here too, the mental health and disability burdens in Australia fall heaviest on some of the most vulnerable citizens, our young, our old, our LGBTQ population, and our Indigenous peoples amongst them. Suicide provides a stark example of how Indigenous Australians also share challenges with Indigenous peoples across the world. Indigenous Australians have double the rate of suicide of the non-Indigenous population, with our kids dying from suicide at up to 5 or 6 times the rate of their non-Indigenous peers. Canadian First Nations suicide rates are twice as high as that of the non-Indigenous Canadians. In the United States, suicide rates amongst Native Americans has been estimated to be at least 1.5 times higher than the national average. And in New Zealand, the suicide rate of Maoris is 1.8 times higher than the Pakeha or the non-Maori population. And the young person's suicide rate is 2.4 times the rate of Pakeha. Now, these populations all report worse mental health and disability outcomes than their non-Indigenous peers. And for us, when compared to non-Indigenous Australians, we as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians have 3 times the rate of high to very high psychological distress, affecting around 30% of our population. We are about 20% more likely to have symptoms associated with clinical depression, and we are hospitalised for mental health conditions at double the rates of non-Indigenous peers. And while few of us drink alcohol when compared to other Australians, those who do are more likely to be problem drinkers or addicted to alcohol. Disability for us is inherently connected to our significantly poorer health when compared to other Australians. And there is a well-known 10-year life expectancy gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians that itself comprises a bundle of health gaps, including the mental health issues that we're discussing today. Chronic disease, and particularly diabetes, which we die from at 6 times the rate of other Australians, is a major cause of disabilities. Communicable trachoma cause blindness and otitis media cause deafness in children is relatively common amongst us. And while we must support those with existing disabilities, an equally important goal must be the prevention of future disabilities. This fundamentally means closing the health gaps and ensuring Indigenous Australians have access to health care. In 2012, about 1 in 4 of us reported a disability compared to 1 in 5 other Australians. Our 0 to 14-year-olds were more than twice as likely as non-Indigenous children to have a disability. And we typically have greater assistance needs and are almost twice as likely to require assistance with communications. Whatever our difficulties, however, what unites us as a global disability and mental health leaders is far greater than what divides us. What I'll do in my keynote today is discuss how Indigenous Australian leaders have responded to our mental health and disability challenges, and distill some of the key messages that will, I hope, be of use to all of us here, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and from whichever part of the world you come from. Indigenous Australia has a health, disability and mental health story that must start with the geography, history and politics of the country. Australia is a 7 million square kilometre island continent. For 50,000 years, Indigenous Australians successfully inhabited all parts of this vast landscape, with climates ranging from lush tropical jungles to arid deserts and then to snow-capped mountains. By 1788, an estimated up to 1 million of us shared 250 different languages across the nation. Key to the phenomenal long-lived success of our traditional ways of living was, and remains today, our cultures. The continuing importance of cultures to our health and well-being is only just starting to be recognised by non-Indigenous Australia. It is sometimes said that culture is life or that culture is health, and that's how connected they are and how much we understand them to be. The slide above is a diagrammatic expression of this cultural, social and well-being concept as we refer to it. Perhaps the key thing to understand is that the country we walk on, the spirit world, and you, your families and your community's very being are deeply connected. And to learn more about the concept, I recommend that you look at the Working Together book that should be in your conference take-home bags, and just be careful of excess luggage as you go home. But we're very, very glad that you're taking a copy. But in a nutshell, the implications are that health practices to us are more than just treating the individual's body or mind in isolation. Health is ultimately about restoring wholeness and connection. Now you'll notice on the slide the historical and social determinants circling the self, and against which culture, social and emotional well-being are providing a protective force. So what are these historical and social determinants, and how have they changed our health and our mental health? In 1788, for us, the profoundly traumatic events of colonisations began. I use the term traumatic deliberately because colonisation occurred within only 3 to 8 generations of Indigenous peoples living today. By intergenerational and transgenerational transmission, the trauma is still with many of us. The first wave of colonisation is not a distant event, historical event. The last officially sanctioned massacre is recorded at Coniston in the Northern Territory in 1928. In a second wave of colonisation, from the late 1800s to 1950, we were subjected to racist legislation that controlled all aspects of our lives. And many of us were further traumatised by being forced off our country and mixed with different cultural groups on reserves and missions that were controlled by missionaries. At best, we've been confined to camps outside of towns under various state legislation and segregationist policies. And this is what happened to some of our elder folk living today, and to our parents, our grandparents and our great-grandparents. So it's still within our frame of reference, our living experience. The other defining experience of this period was the forcible removal of tens of thousands of children, who were often referred to as the stolen generations, to be assimilated into non-Indigenous society. Many people living today are directly affected, and the trauma transmitted down family lines. From the 1950s on, segregation and reserves were dismantled, and anti-racist and decolonisation norms took root in the West. The last of the residential facilities closed in the early 80s, and a couple of weeks ago it was announced that 71 former residents of the Home for Indigenous Stolen Generations Children in Darwin, who suffered horrific sexual and physical abuse, will be compensated in what their lawyer says is the largest class action in Northern Territory history. Legal equality and the restoration of our human rights was of course welcome, but a perverse outcome was that it enabled us to access both welfare and alcohol without restriction. And in practice, legal equality on its own did nothing to bring us closer to the economy. services or any other benefits that are enjoyed by other Australian citizens. And this scenario led to what my esteemed colleagues, Professor Helen Milroy and Ernest Hunter, have referred to as normative instability in many of our communities, where welfare and alcohol dependency were layered upon trauma and distress, dysfunction in other words. Across the country then we remain apart in deep collective poverty and without access to political power. We were by that point a small minority in our own land. Even today we comprise only 3% of the total Australian population. But by 1967 there was enough disquiet and international embarrassment about our squalid living conditions that a referendum to change the Constitution and provide the Federal Parliament with the constitutional power to make laws specifically for Aboriginal people were passed, and with an unprecedented and overwhelming public support of 90.77%, which is the most successful referendum that we've ever held in Australia, and only 8 of 44 referenda have ever passed in Australia, and that one, to recognise us to be counted on the census, was most popular. The promise was that the Commonwealth would step in to ensure we receive the services and support that the states and territories had failed to provide and rectify decades of segregation. But this did not start to happen until the mid-1990s. And while there's been much change since the 1967 referendum, racism and social exclusion remain a defining feature of our lives. In an authoritative 2006 survey, 57% of Indigenous Australians agreed that Australia is a racist country. In 2010, almost 10% of Indigenous Australians were estimated to suffer deep and persistent social exclusion, compared to approximately only 5% of the general population. So in this situation, social determinants continue to have a much greater impact on our health, mental health and rates of disability. Injuries and violence also contribute to both disability, trauma and mental health problems. In 2014-15, more than 1 in 5 of us reported experiencing physical or threatening violence, and that's 2.5 times the rate of non-Indigenous peoples. And the most frequent recorded contributors to high rates of psychological distress are the deaths of a family member or friend, a close family member or friend, serious illness, unemployment, and mental illness itself. Alcohol and drug use and suicide are also problems in many communities. And racism too cannot be ignored. In a 2016 survey, 37% of us reported experiencing verbal racial abuse in the previous 6 months. And racism has been connected to psychological distress and trauma in the United States African American population, and there's little reason to doubt that similar impacts are taking place on us here in Australia. All of this hits our friends and families hard. Sexual abuse is also reported at higher rates in our communities. Our precious children are 8 times more likely to be in child protection services than non-Indigenous, and disabling developmental trauma in our children is an emerging problem. For some of us, our continuing social exclusion is connected to where we live in Australia. In 2016, the population of Australia was just over 24 million people, and about 10% smaller than the combined 2013 populations of the Netherlands, who are here, and Belgium, but spread out in an area over 100 times the size of both those countries. 82% live in just 50 urban centres, and almost half live in just Sydney and Melbourne alone. This leaves remote and very remote areas, so called because of their distance from urban centres, that have well-established service hubs. The remote and very remote areas are shown in blue and purple, respectively, on the map on the left-hand side of the slide above. Now, like the general population, about 80% of the estimated 750,000 Indigenous Australians today also live in major or regional cities or close to them. However, 15% or so live in very remote areas, and that's that purple shaded area, where they comprise about 45% of the population. So 15% of our Indigenous population comprise 45% in the very remote areas, and that's tens of thousands of Indigenous Australians. In these areas, the negative impact of the lack of reach of government health, mental health and disability services, let alone market-driven service providers, falls disproportionately on us as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Yet there are some compensatory factors of remote living. Research suggests that the protective forces of practising culture and ceremony, of being with family and community, of walking on country and nurturing a fiercely proud Indigenous identity develops resilience against the impacts of stress and trauma. And the ability to do these things is enhanced in remote areas. But nonetheless, to be living with a disability or mental health issue in these areas is a significant challenge. I'm chair of Ninety One, an organisation that worked with Indigenous Australians with disabilities and their carers living in remote towns and communities, and particularly in the Anangu, Pitjantjatjara, Yankunytjatjara lands in South Australia in 2015. Now, Ninety One is engaged to identify the needs of Indigenous Australians in these areas as part of the rollout of the National Disability Insurance Scheme that Eddie referred to earlier. Now although we noticed that people with disabilities also benefited in ways from their remote living, we found poverty and poor housing, let alone housing modified to be able to accommodate people with disabilities, was commonplace. Demanding family and spouse carer roles was also the norm. There was also almost no expectation of transformative, life-changing disability support on the part of Indigenous clients. There were also gaps in the cultural appropriateness of the services being delivered. And poor disability literacy meant that people with roughly identical disabilities received very different supports. So how has Australia and the Indigenous Australia responded to the situation? Well, from day one of colonisation, Indigenous peoples and their leaders have resisted, gathered and planned to regain control of their lives. Every decade since has had its heroes who struggle for change. And Indigenous health leaders have responded to the health, disability and mental health challenges we face at three levels. From within our communities, through our community-based and controlled organisations, and at the macro or state or national levels. In practice, our leaders might begin leadership roles in their community, led through community organisations, and eventually emerge at a state or national level with their leadership. For them, there may be no neat delineation between the levels of leadership in which they operate. And indeed, they may significantly contribute as leaders and advocates precisely because they know their communities and can ensure that their voices are heard at the national level, which is so important when we look at such a big country as Australia. Even when operating at the state or national levels, it is critical for us in leadership roles to not lose touch of our communities. An Indigenous leader is always accountable to those they represent. And this is one reason why it's important for governments to not cherry-pick Indigenous leaders aligned with their political agendas. Instead, they should look at those with genuine support in communities or who may otherwise spearhead movements with clear Indigenous support. And I'm reminded here again of some of the work that Ninety One has done with the exceptional women of the Ngunnawal, Pitjantjatjara and Yankunytjatjara Women's Council. And this organisation was formed in 1980 to deliver community, family, research and advocacy services in the vast central desert region of Australia. Now, Ninety One has worked with the NPY Women's Council to understand the needs of children and young people with disabilities in these areas to inform the National Disability Insurance Scheme rollout there. And I note that Andrea Mason, the chair of the NPY Women's Group Council, also works at the national level and was just this month appointed to the Prime Minister's, well, it was actually last month, Prime Minister's Indigenous Advisory Council that formally advises the Australian Government on Indigenous issues. So we're very confident that Andrew will raise issues about remote Australia. So here is a classic example of how the three levels of Indigenous leadership interrelate. Now, focusing on the health and mental health leadership that has also been built from the ground up. From the late 1960s on, in the absence of effective government action and as an expression of self-determination, Indigenous community leaders in Sydney and Melbourne organised to provide their own health services. A community control model was developed in which local Indigenous boards of management control these services, and Chika mentioned one of that he's involved with this morning. So over time, Australian governments have begun providing financial support such that 150 or so of these services now exist. Some are big urban medical centres that provide holistic and comprehensive primary health care, and others in remote areas might just be a clinic with only a nurse and maybe a visiting GP or physician. In regional and remote areas, Aboriginal community-controlled health services are used by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. Each state and territory also has a community-controlled health service peak body, and at the national level, the peak body for community-controlled health services is the National Aboriginal Community-Controlled Health Organisation, or NACCHO, and it has and continues to play a key leadership role in the Indigenous health movement. On these foundations, in 2006, I was honoured as the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner of the Australian Human Rights Commission to help establish and act as the inaugural chair of the Close the Gap campaign for Indigenous health equality. The campaign aims to close the 10-year life expectancy gap, happened to be 17 years at that stage, between Indigenous and other Australians. But we used a human rights-based approach with non-negotiables including Indigenous leadership, partnership between us and the Australian governments, equality-based health planning and the use of equality targets. Now, the campaign membership comprised Australia's peak Indigenous and non-Indigenous health bodies, health professionals and human rights organisations, including NACCHO, the peak body. And membership was contingent on agreement that Indigenous-led organisations would always have the final say in how the campaign operated, which I think is critical. The campaign was founded on a clear articulation of need with goals and principles based on human rights law. It was framed as both a drive for Indigenous health outcome equality and equality of opportunity for healthy life. Eventually, over 30 Indigenous and non-Indigenous organisations and bodies joined the campaign, and they were self-funded to be independent and operate a dedicated secretariat. And with the support of Oxfam, the campaign implemented a remarkably effective grassroots strategy to garner the support of the media, the public and Indigenous people and communities. And we've got about over 300,000 people signed up as members of the Close the Gap campaign. So today, Close the Gap Day, which is celebrated on the 16th of March this year, is an important fixture in the Indigenous calendar. Politically, the campaign secured multi-partisan political support through the signing of the Close the Gap Statement of Intent by the then Prime Minister and leader of all major political parties at both the national and state and territory levels. And critical to our advocacy was agreeing and endlessly repeating the key messages until they began to be repeated back to us from the mouths of politicians and bureaucrats as if their own ideas. We shaped the discourse, in other words. In this way, we succeeded in securing over $5 billion in additional funding to address our health, housing and other social determinants. Further, 2 health targets were set to close the gap in life expectancy by 2031 and to halve the under 5 child mortality gap by 2018. And further targets for key social determinants have also been set. So each year in the first week of Parliament, the Australian Prime Minister makes a statement to the nation on these targets, and the campaign, we publish our own independent shadow report. So the government will say what's been achieved and what hasn't been achieved, and we'll say whether we agree or don't agree. And and so forth. So it's an accountability measure that's unsurpassed anywhere. But hopefully that's going to take hold of a few other campaigns that we've got. Because progress is slow, the campaign consistently must remind politicians and the media that we cannot turn around the disadvantage of Indigenous Australians overnight. Life expectancy will only lift following improvements to outcomes in numerous areas. And there are real and positive signs of change. One of my other hats that I wore that is mentioned is that of the National Coordinator for Tackling Indigenous Smoking. And I don't encourage anybody to smoke, so there's no such thing as a safe smoke, is there, Pat? In this role, and through a significantly funded Indigenous-specific anti-smoking campaign, we are seeing smoking rates consistently drop over time and potentially huge benefits and health implications. And particularly we're looking at it from the mainstream of smoking and mental health issues and the effect of smoking on medications and so forth, because they do have some very detrimental impacts. In 2006, when we started the Close the Gap campaign, mental health was a poor cousin to physical health. In part, this was because we were not yet nationally organised as mental health leadership bodies at that time. The Australian Indigenous Psychologists Association, the peak body for Indigenous psychologists, was not established in 2008, and the Healing Foundation was established in 2009. And I commend the Healing Foundation to you as a great example of an Indigenous-led healing initiative that has supported many community-level healing programs and activities. So happily, mental health is now at the heart of efforts to achieve health equality more broadly, as well as being understood as a significant challenge in its own right. The National Health Leadership Forum that emerged from the Indigenous Leadership Group of the Close the Gap campaign in 2011 is now the overriding National Indigenous Health Peaks Forum. It has successfully partnered with the Australian Government to develop the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Plan 2013 to 2023 and has ensured that mental health is included in it. The Health Plan Implementation Plan, which followed, and a task force is now working to operationalise the implementation plan, and a multi-portfolio social and cultural determinants working group to develop a blueprint to apply a determinants approach to health policy and programs. The start of the Indigenous mental health movement can be dated to 1995 and the Ways Forward National Indigenous Mental Health Report developed under joint Indigenous and non-Indigenous leadership. The growing movement was boosted when the 1997 Bringing Them Home report brought home the impacts of the forcible child removals on our mental health. And Bringing Them Home recommended a national apology that was eventually made by the Australian Government in February 2008. And I had the privilege to be nominated by the Stolen Generations people to provide the formal response to the Prime Minister's apology on their behalf. Over the past decade, the governments of the states and territories have also apologised. So we've now got nationally that recognition. And more recently, I commended the Australian Psychological Society for its 2016 apology to us for some psychologists' role in child removals. And it's my hope that other bodies of professionals that were involved, my fellow social workers, psychiatrists and so on, will also follow that lead and make apologies. Another result of Bringing Them Home was the funding of counselling and social and emotional wellbeing services, primarily aimed at the stolen generations and in some community-controlled health services. And today, larger services are likely to employ mental health professionals on site or as visitors. Aboriginal mental health workers are also an established element of the workforce in these services. However, amongst Aboriginal community-controlled health services overall, about 6 in 10 still report gaps in mental health and social and emotional wellbeing services, and about half report gaps in alcohol and other drug services. Now, roughly half of the Indigenous population use or relies on community-controlled health services, and as such, the absence of mental health and other services in them is a significant barrier to treatment. The Indigenous mental health movement has two main objectives. First, building on the community-controlled health service model to establish mental health services controlled by and specifically for Indigenous peoples and that operate within a cultural framework. And second, to ensure that general population mental health services are responsive to our often greater and more complex needs and cultural, experiential and language difficulties. Remember, I said only half of the Indigenous population use the community-controlled health services and the other use mainstream and other services. So we need to ensure that everybody is able to culturally cope with delivering services to our people. Critically to both these efforts is the renewal of the National Strategic Framework for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's mental health and social and emotional wellbeing that was initially developed in 2004 by Indigenous cultural, social and emotional wellbeing, mental health and suicide prevention leaders. And I'm pleased to report that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Advisory Group, or ATSIM-SPAG, a mostly Indigenous body that I co-chair with my good friend Professor Pat Dudgeon, and we advise the government on mental health, suicide prevention and social and emotional wellbeing and other things. We've been charged with this renewal, and we believe that that's very imminent a response on that. Other important related policies that emphasise the need for Indigenous control and Indigenous-specific responses include the 2013 National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Suicide Prevention Strategy and the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander People's Drug Strategy 2014 to 2019, and both were developed under Indigenous leadership. Now, looking forward, trauma is increasingly being recognised as perhaps a foundational challenge not only to improving Indigenous Australians' mental health, but also for addressing a range of so-called wicked problems that continue to undermine our communities' lives. A wicked problem denotes a challenge that is difficult or seems impossible to solve because of contradictory or challenging causal factors that are often difficult to recognise in the first place. And it's my belief that many such wicked problems have much of their origins in the multiple and compounding layers of trauma in the Indigenous population. In addition to historical traumas, this includes traumas from repeated exposure to life stresses in the present day, and things like racism that I mentioned, and traumas from exposure to violence and childhood stresses, and later with potential developmental impacts that can lead to disability. And I note with some hope that ATSIM-SPAG has begun to map the beginning of what may be a national comprehensive response to trauma in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities that includes healing and halting the transmission of past traumas as well as preventing new traumas. Indigenous mental health leadership took a significant step forward with in 2013 with the establishment of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Leadership in Mental Health, or ATSIM-SPAG, ATSMIL, always a big mouthful, of which I'm a member and Professor Dudgeon is the chair. And ATSMIL is independent and operates its own secretariat, and it comprises a core group of senior Indigenous people based in or associated with national and state level mental health commissions. But the Healing Foundation, APIA, the Australian Indigenous Psychologists Association, and NACHO, who I previously mentioned, are also members. And NATSMIL was established to help implement the international 2010 Whakawata Declaration that, as many of you will know, recognises the importance of Indigenous leadership in mental health systems to better respond to the mental health needs of their Indigenous populations in a culturally appropriate way. To that end, NATSMIL developed in 2015 the Gaya Dewey, or Proud Spirit Declaration, as a domestic companion document to the Whakawata Declaration. It comprises five themes, including two that focus on the culturally different nature of Indigenous leadership itself. And I'm happy to report that the references to the declaration are in draft copies of the 5th National Mental Health Plan, Australia's overarching mental health plan that is currently being renewed. And this achievement bodes well for the future of Indigenous mental health leadership in the country. In parallel to the above, a national Indigenous disability movement can be traced to a 1999 national gathering of Indigenous disability leaders in Alice Springs. From there, the New South Wales Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Disability Network was established in 2002, and in 2010, the first People's Disability Network with CEO Damien Griffiths, who will be speaking tomorrow, I believe, at this event, was established. Proudly, and for all Indigenous Australians, this is the only organisation in the world constituted and governed by Indigenous peoples with disabilities. It is also an important part of the broader Indigenous health movement in Australia. In 2014, the first People's Disability Network chaired an interagency meeting of government departments to develop an Indigenous Disability Action Plan under the National Disability Strategy, and an Indigenous reference group has also been established. I finish this part of my keynote by including on the slide above what I believe to be some of the key themes in challenging leadership. God, it works. I want to close by looking at a potential challenge to Indigenous community leadership in relation to mental health and disability services. In 2015, 31 primary health networks were established as part of an ongoing reform effort to decentralise the Australian primary health care system. PHNs, they're called, are intended to promote responsive, regional level needs-based planning and service delivery. The government has agreed to 6 key priorities for targeted work by PHNs, and these include mental health and Indigenous health. Further to this, PHNs have recently been given the task of overseeing the establishment of a stepped care model of primary mental health care clinical services in their regions, including specific Indigenous mental health and suicide prevention activities. And PHNs are required to work closely with the National Disability Insurance Scheme providers because of the need for psychiatric disability support services integrated into the stepped mental health care model. Now, a key PHN role is mapping service gaps and commissioning new services where gaps are identified. And this requires them to work closely with the community-controlled services and Indigenous communities. But it's not clear how Indigenous community leadership will be preserved in this situation. There are concerns that this will amount to a consultation rather than a negotiation process. A further concern is with the proper roles of market-driven processes, such as some PHN's tender-based commissioning processes that have historically not delivered the right services to Indigenous communities. And too often these tender processes are boiled down to a competition of who can draft the best application and not who is able to offer the best services. So we have real concerns, and our group, the advisory group, is doing a little report on this to the ministers. Now, I've been lucky to play a small part in a decades-long Indigenous health and mental health movement involving hundreds of thousands of Indigenous leaders, advocates, experts and stakeholders and their non-Indigenous allies working at all levels. The cumulative effects of this, I believe, is that we have established the foundations for future Indigenous Australians with mental health conditions and disability to lead contributing lives and partake in thriving communities. Now, despite the disheartening statistics, my message to you is one of hope, of survival against the odds, of great resilience and of the value of struggle in the face of adversity. Our global movement is far from over and work remains to be done. And like democracy, ensuring our brothers and sisters with mental health problems or issues and disabilities lead the best possible lives is likely to require eternal vigilance. It remains to future generations and future leaders to keep these flames alive and to write the next chapters. And I hope this keynote will inspire and support this future. And with a view to stimulating a lively discussion, I close with 3 challenges, my 3 challenges to you, as the slide shows, which we'll discuss in a minute, but also leave with one of my mantras that I use very often, and that is, from self-respect comes dignity, From dignity comes hope, and from hope comes resilience. Thank you.
Tom Calma, stay with us for a moment. Eddie Bartnick.
Thank you very much, Professor Calma. What a powerful summary of mental health and disability in Australia, and for your messages of resilience and hope. Tom's observations, I'm sure, will resonate with many people both in Australia and other countries. We will have an opportunity to discuss those parallels shortly. And as I was hearing you speak, Tom, your message about people getting control of their lives sits very strongly with the values of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. On behalf of our combined organisations, we'd like to thank you very much, Tom, for your presentation, but also for your many contributions to the community. I don't know how Tom still finds time to be Chancellor for a university and to give back to the Australian sort of wider community. So, Tom, we have a gift for you. So, yes, and the beautiful book next to it.
Thank
you. Yes. Thank you very much. I'm now going to hand back to Natasha Mitchell, who, so we can discuss Tom's insights and the issues they raise in your lives as leaders. And from now on, it's going to be Natasha's show. I'll leave you in her capable hands for the remainder of the program.
Thanks
you,
very
Natasha.
much, Eddie.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Great. If we could have the last page of the last slide up, please. Is that possible? Fantastic. Thank you, Tom. And I love how we made you take your own gift. And some of the thoughts that I have from Tom's presentation, in addition to the questions we're going to pose to your tables, is often health and mental health and disability leaders like yourself are activists. You know, there's an inherent activism to being a leader in this arena and in representing the communities that you want to support or that you are a part of as leaders. So, and the other thing that emerges for me is in this era of fake news and such things, the power of data. You know, that Closing the Gap report that comes out each year, it's sobering. It's a tough read, it's sometimes very depressing, but it fundamentally creates a path of accountability for leaders. You know, they must be accountable to that data. So that's another point that I would think of, and also just the power of leaders to say sorry, either for past actions of policies or practices or services, but also contemporary leaders to acknowledge, you know, their own deficits as you try and build and lead services in your own countries and your own communities. That really, it's very hard to acknowledge mistakes, isn't it, as well, along the way, and how do you build a conversation that allows that to happen? And the saying of sorry, you know, that image of the two women hugging each other, you know, it still brings tears to me every time I see that photo. So, you know, the power of sorry. So these questions, the first one, we'd like you to discuss all three at your table. If you're at a table with colleagues that you know, you might want to sort of shuffle around and do a bit of a swap. It's up to you. I'll leave that to you. You can manage where you sit throughout the day. You might want to change spots throughout the day. But those three questions, Tom. We have a question here, and I'll come over to Alan shortly. Thank you.
Yeah, it's Jenny
Or a
Edwards.
comment.
Yeah, from the Mental Health Foundation in the UK. First of all, I'd like to thank Tom for absolutely an amazing speech. It's very inspirational, and while the UK isn't one of the nations with Indigenous peoples in that sense, there are many things that you've said that are very, very transferable. I think the thing that we've for a number of different countries around this table. And I think what we found particularly strong was your reference to a human rights structure underneath as being the basis on which you could argue all the other points and argue for inclusion, argue for leadership, making sure that a focus on localism and competitive services didn't trump what is fundamentally people's right to good health services and to good health support. So thank you for that. And I don't know if you've got reflections on how we could spread your learning more widely.
But just can I pick up on that too? I mean, human rights sometimes feels nebulous, doesn't it? When systems take over, that core vision gets lost in the moment-to-moment and day-to-day delivery. So how do you retain that core substrate in your work? Putting it back to you.
Well, I don't know. It's something that we're working on and struggling with, really. I think it's bringing the language that can seem remote into the language that feels right for the people who know that what they're getting isn't good enough and want that to change. And I know the number of workshops I've been at where people have said, no, I'm not a service user, I'm a citizen, are sort of they stick in my mind, because that means that people are recognising that their own advocacy is actually probably the greatest ingredient in creating good health for them and their community.
And language matters, doesn't it? I'm not a patient, I'm not a service user, I'm a human being with human rights. Tom?
No, exactly, and I think it's very important, and I guess if anybody's interested, to go onto the Australian Human Rights Commission website, and you just go into Close the Gap, and there's a ton of work there, and especially some of the early work, the report I did in 2005, which established all of this, and that was really on a human rights-based approach, and that's really about engaging with the community, the people most affected, is paramount in what we do, making sure that we apply things like the principle of progressive realisation, meaning you've got to set some really good time frames that are achievable, and the whole essence of what we're trying to achieve is equality, and so it's the right to equality, and so things like accountability is there. We'll set the time frames, set the targets, make sure that all the parties are accountable to doing it, make sure that funding is based on need, and once those principles are there, and you have the accountability both back to the community, and as we've got various Prime Ministers to do since 2008, is to give the report back to Parliament, which is the public accountability for what government services are required to be provided to all citizens. And that's the key thing. You've got citizenship rights, you've got human rights, and human rights apply to every citizen of the world.
Did anyone talk about some of the marketplace challenges of service delivery? There was a lot of buzz in this table and I'm not seeing enough hands up. Yes, thank you. Let's get a mic to the middle. Hands up if there's a comment or a point that you'd like to make that emerged at your table, just to get the conversation started across the room. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Lynn Lane from New Zealand. We didn't actually talk about this at our table, but about 15 years ago we had the emergence of by Maori, for Maori service providers, and we recognised that they were going to fail if we didn't support them. And so what the government did was that they set up a new department and funded it $10 million a year simply to train and provide support to providers to stay viable and to continue growing. And that was an extremely successful initiative. Te Rau Matatini still exists. It's run by Maori to support the development and growth of Maori organisations and to train their leaders. So if you want Indigenous leaders, then one of the things that you can do is set up organisations to grow them.
So what sort of training, yes, but what sort of practical support does that $10 million a year provide?
Whatever they need, they decide. They developed a template for self-audit for organisations. They identified what they required in order to stay viable or to grow. They set up scholarship funds. Mason Jury was on their board and their advisor, who's one of the icons in terms of Maori service development and research. They grew research fellows. So they've set up a whole program of activities. So you can go online and just Google them, just have a look at what they're doing. But it was a very successful model in New Zealand. And many of you will know that they've gone from strength to strength in terms of Maori providers.
Great, thank you. Introduce yourself.
I'm Donna Blair. I manage a alcohol and drug service in Rotorua. Te Utahina, we've got some AOD contracts in adult youth as well as residential for our Midlands region. Ngā mihi nui kia koe, Tom. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
And kia ora, Lynn. Lynn is correct in terms of some of the workforce arms, particularly Māori focusing for Māori. The only thing that I would say that's slightly different, Lynn, is while there are a lot of Māori providers doing some fantastic work, we are still being undermined by non-Māori services, and a lot of our contracts are being uplifted from Māori providers and going to national non-Māori providers. I've got a huge issue with that, and constantly challenging our government and ministers around that stuff. Kia ora.
So don't sit down yet. Tell us more about what is happening and why that loss of provision or power is happening.
Well, actually, I don't have the answer, and neither do they. So I can only talk about my experience in my community, as I have 3 FTEs being uplifted to go to non-Māori services, and I cannot get an answer to that.
So services are being taken away from Maori providers. And has that come through this competitive tendering sort of process?
Yes, it is. But on the upside, we also won quite a significant contract from a non-Māori provider, given that a lot of the DTU, drug treatment units in prisons, are full of Māori. So we have got one gain in that respect. But I do challenge non-Māori providers, when you are going for contracting, kia tūpato, be careful where you're taking that funding from. They're often from Māori providers.
So as a leader, do you feel that you have got the voice of the ears of the people who are driving the tendering process?
I get invited back. Surprises me, but I don't know that I've got the ear. But I think I've got a lot of support from other Māori colleagues and service providers. We're quite united in our conversations, but you still get on and do the work. At the end of the day, we still have mahi to do. And like Tom said in his kōrero, I'm not just responsible to the funder and our government, I'm responsible to a whole community of people, our families, our community, particularly Indigenous communities. And if you don't get that right, your head's on a platter.
Yeah, in many ways, more ways than one.
Yeah, so
family as well. So what about in Canada? Yes, thank you. We've got a comment there. Some of our colleagues in Canada here as well might be wrestling with these issues.
So I'm Arthur Evans. I'm from the United States, and I'm actually on the public payer side. And this is an issue that we deal with quite often. And there are 2 things that I've done as a public payer to try to address this. One is to build into every competitive process criteria that makes it almost impossible for someone who doesn't have ongoing experience with the community to be successful in obtaining a grant. And then the other is to make sure that people with lived experience are a part of the decision-making process. And in fact, in my agency, we do not make any funding decision without people from the community being a part of the ongoing decision-making process. So those are 2 ways that we've tried to manage this whole issue of people who don't have experience with the community sort of coming in and being more competitive.
Yes. Okay. Any other points or to pick up on? Yes, thank you. I think this is Rennie.
Hi, I'm Rennie Linklater from Canada, and I work at the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, which is a hospital with provincial responsibility in Ontario. And so what comes to my mind around Indigenous leadership is that whether we're talking about services within our communities, within Indigenous-led services, or whether we're talking about mainstream services, and we know Professor Calma made a comment about 50% of the Indigenous people are accessing both, right? Indigenous services as well as mainstream services. So there's a real need across the entire system to build capacity. But what I feel really strongly about is that we have Indigenous people leading those processes. And so where we have mainstream organizations, it becomes really important to have a core Indigenous team doing that work and really developing partnerships with communities and really engaging and ensuring that we're being culturally responsive.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Over here. We'll wrap shortly for morning tea, but I just want to grab a little bit more in the room while we can.
Kia ora mihinui kia koutou katoa, ko Paula Sidena hau, o ngā puinui tono hau. Kia ora Tom. Awa hei kore. We stick to the smoke-free, we work together in smoke-free land. I just wanted to just pick up those 3 questions again, and 2 things. If you want, Lord knows there's enough of us sick people out there, we don't have to fight over the clients. So what the tendering service does is pit service against service, and you lose innovation, and you create cost, and you just churn the wheels. So we don't like, and I've run Māori organisations and I run mainstream services, population whole services that have obligations for Māori and Pacific. And you don't get better outcomes by pitching services against each other. Data is how you make sure people are accountable, count the right things, apples for apples. But if you want to deal with a leadership question, you've got to have it, and if I can just demonstrate, it's across. You've got to have it top and across, and sometimes it's the level 3 positions. If you have enough Māori Pacific, LGBTI, women, consumers at that level, they will drive the cultural change that makes organisations responsive to the needs of Indigenous people. You don't just buy it in, you don't have one advisor at the top, you've got to do it across that way. And when you get that, you get it, it works.
So just to point back to you just briefly, how do you start building the cross? What's the first step people should do?
Start with the human resources people, the people who hire. What are they hiring for? What are the KPIs? Who makes the cut? Start with the human resources people. You've got a strategy, you'll have a business plan, start with HR.
Fantastic. Lots of nodding heads in the room on some of this stuff. So you'll continue the conversation at morning tea. Tom. Alan Rosen, local superstar, psychiatrist, leader of services, activist.
Thank you, Natasha.
All round good fun.
It's mutual. These communal admiration societies, it's a wonderful mental health community we have. So it goes out to all of us. Tom, I congratulate you particularly on the mention, and thank you for the mention of the apology and what we can do. What we can do as non-Indigenous people in this sphere, as well as the practical things that have been mentioned, which I agree with, but I think the issue of apology is important. And TAMS, the Transforming Australia's Mental Health Service System, has put out the, which is an offshoot of the Themes Conference, the Mental Health Service Conference of Australia and New Zealand, has put out the challenge to the mental health professions to make an apology for our contribution as different mental health professions to the predicament that Aboriginal people and other Indigenous people have had in the world. This has gone to all the professions, but the APS, the Australian Psychological Society, is the first, I think, worldwide to make that apology. They've made it in their own words. They haven't followed the template that we have provided, but, but other professions are looking at it, and it is now going to a presidential debate in Berlin at the World Psychiatric Association in October. So there is some progress happening with it. But thank you for the mention. On particular tribute to Pat Dudgeon and to Helen Milroy, who have helped and encouraged this process along.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you. And I should just say, for those who haven't met Pat Dudgeon, she's come up. That name has come up at least 4 times. That's Pat. If you'd like to grab her and talk to her. One brief comment. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this stuff is very important. I'm Eduardo Vega from the U.S. With Dignity Recovery Action International. The integration, I always think that there's really 2 problems, though, that we don't really get to, is that meaningful involvement, meaningful integration of lived experience, whether it's cultural or of disability or of mental health conditions, is a really thorough project. You have to go from inclusion, which sometimes it just feels like tokenism, to real active integration, and there's a whole process there. So, we've developed, and I think that one of the things that we'd like to see a lot more is, a process for organizations to really think strategically and technically about how are you going to go from where you are to the next step in terms of empowering your communities, bringing the wisdom of lived experience into your organization or your project or your program, and really plan to do that over time. Now, the other side of this, though, is that a lot of people, whether they've not had opportunities because of interrupted education or because of not having the same educational opportunities as professionals, they're not really truly able to be empowered because they don't have the support and the learning ability to get to the place where they can be really effective as change agents within organizations. So I really feel like this is so important, but to do it right, we really have to bring focus both on strategy, also on training and support, and helping guide people who are trying to bring their lived experience into places where they can be effective without being isolated and manage the stigma and discrimination and things that are going to come along with it. So putting these two together, to me, those are the wheels that you need to have on your car if you're going to move forward and make it really true empowerment.
Thank you very much. So we have, someone has emphasised, start with human resources. Who are you hiring according to what criteria? Support those people that you do hire to be the leaders that they have the capability to be. And we're going to talk much more about lived experience with an incredible speaker after morning tea. So we'll pick that up. Any final comments from you, Tom?
Look, just thank you for everybody being here. You know, in this sector, both our sectors, we have to really work together, and I think we can work together. Can I just pick up on a couple of the points that were said? I think none of us want to have and see token appointments on our boards and committees. They've got to be real and meaningful. But the first step is opening the door to allow participation, and then once that door is open and people put their hand up, they need to be supported to get into those positions, as has just been mentioned. And we've got a lot of good people out there who may not be, you know, all that well formally educated, but can offer a fair bit, you know. And I think the lived experience as somebody affected, but also as a carer, is really important that we do listen and be directed by those people, because we can do as much as we like and try and see things from a principal position, but a really informed position is when you've got people with the lived experience or first-hand experience as a carer to help guide us. But I think, you know, you all know that, but I think it's always important, and particularly important if we've got bureaucrats around to hear this, because too often they don't participate in forums like this. So we've got a lot of like minds here. We've just got to look at ways to be able to influence the politicians and bureaucrats who hold the purse strings often and determine the policy. But thank you. Enjoy morning tea.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom. Fantastic. And for all the bureaucrats in the room, there are psychologists available for support if you need it today.